So where are we heading? Based on conversations I've been having with investors, there's a couple things happening. One, they're not going to drop the price, right? Because if you have a vacant unit, you now have to raise the price to compensate for the lack of growth and to offset any other units you have in the building. So let's say you have a duplex, 2 bedrooms are each unit. Market rent might be $2,000 a month, but because you had a rent controlled tenant in there for 20 years, rent may be $1,000. Now, instead of $2,000 for that vacant unit, they need to offset the cost of that lower unit. Therefore, they're going to raise the price. Hey everyone, Rick Albert here with a special episode of the Key to the City of Angels where it's just me. And I wanted to do an episode dedicated to what recently passed by City Council regarding rent increases. So let's go ahead and get started. Basically, it passed 12-2 with Bob Bloomfield and John Lee voting no, basically saying that now instead of it being based on the consumer price index in terms of how much you can raise rent, originally there was a ceiling of 8%. Now it's been dropped down to 4%. Also, as part of that, before property owners, if they included electricity and gas, would be able to charge an additional 1% per utility. That has now been eliminated. So a lot of tenant advocacy groups actually wanted it to be kept at 3%. A lot of people are actually happy about this, except for landlords. So let's dive into what this actually means for housing and where we're probably going to see this head. So here's the deal. You have a cap on how much money a property owner can raise or rent, effectively raising their income. The issue is nothing else is really regulated. So for example, property taxes are capped at 2% per year, but they can still go up. Insurance does go up. But more importantly, basically your vendors are not capped. So your gardener who's paying $100 a month today, next year might charge you $110. Sounds like not a big deal when it's only $10, but that's really actually a 10% bump. Your handyman, I remember years ago, it was $100 to $125 a day. Now it's $200 to $250. A landlord I know just paid $150 just to light a pilot light. So the reality is we have a lot of these homeowners, a lot of these landlords, where their margins, which were already squeezed, are now being squeezed even more. Now, there was a study done earlier this year. It was about 200 pages that basically said that property owners actually have a ton of margin and that they're making tons of money off of these tenants. But what the report didn't highlight was that most property owners actually have a mortgage. So yeah, if you have a property with no mortgage on it, you could probably afford it. But the majority of people have mortgages. For those that have been following me for a while, you know that real estate really shines. It's really a wealth building tool when you leverage. Otherwise, you're actually better off putting money in the stock market and not have to deal with the headaches. It also doesn't factor in potential cost of attorneys. Eventually, you're going to have to replace the roof at $20,000. Eventually, you're going to have to replace the hot water heater at $10,000 to $15,000. All these costs going into January 2026, you're going to have homeowners are now going to have to include a working stove and fridge. Now that's an added expense, and they're going to have air conditioning units, which you might say mini splits $2,500 to install, but that's not the end of it. You still have the electrical itself to make sure you can support it. Can the electrical panel in this 1920s building support it? We are also seeing concerns where there are buildings that were built in the 20s, these large apartment buildings in downtown, and they're on master meters, meaning they're not split. So now the property owner can't charge extra for electricity. That's going to be a problem because these buildings are already old. They're already struggling to get insurance. So where are we heading? Based on conversations I've been having with investors, there's a couple things happening. One, they're not going to drop the price, right? Because if you have a vacant unit, you now have to raise the price to compensate for the lack of growth and to offset any other units you have in the building. So let's say you have a duplex, 2 bedrooms are each unit. Market rent might be $2,000 a month, but because you had a rent controlled tenant in there for 20 years, rent may be $1,000. Now, instead of $2,000 for that vacant unit, they need to offset the cost of that lower unit. Therefore, they're going to raise the price. I talked to a landlord recently who's been in the business for over 30 years. He flat out told me, Rick, I won't be able to lower my prices. I actually have to let the unit sit empty. So basically, he's saying, I'm going to go out there at this high price, and that's it. You're not going to have a choice. Now, studies have shown from economists that this is common, that landlords have to raise the prices to offset not just the lack of increases over time, but also the eventual risks of evictions, which in LA is very difficult to evict a tenant, even if they're in the wrong. And if certain situations, the tenant actually gets free legal services. So if you think about it, someone could sign it and agree to a lease, stop paying rent, get free legal services while the landlord's still on the hook for all the expenses. This is not to try to create a sob story for landlords and try to give sympathy towards landlords. This is just the reality of it. So we're going to see higher rents to offset the growth and the loss. The other thing is they're going to do less in terms of repairs. And I don't mean that in form of if the AC is not working, they're not going to fix it. It's more of the AC is 15 years old, needs to be replaced, but instead they're just going to fix it to move along, which means there's going to be more service calls from tenants. Basically, their quality of life may go down because of this. The landlord's only obligated to fix it. They're not obligated to replace, even though it might make more sense. Take a roof leak. Roof leaks, are you going to replace the roof? You probably should, but are you going to spend 20 grand, 25,000? No, you're probably going to spend a couple $1,000 to patch and hope for the best. So we're going to see some of that. I was reading comments on Instagram and someone said that in LA, you're paying Mercedes prices for a Honda unit. And that's exactly right. That's exactly what's going to happen because they're not going to have the same margin going forward. So again, quality of life for tenants is likely, honestly, to go down because there won't be enough money there. The third thing that I think we're going to see is, honestly, people selling. Literally within 24 hours of that announcement, I had 3 of my clients tell me that they want to sell. And we've already listed one of them. So we're having investors, mostly mom and pops, who are going to say, I can't deal with this anymore. I don't have the time. I don't have the capacity. I'm selling. And if these homes sell to an owner occupied, that means less inventory, right? So how do we create affordable housing? You need the inventory, right? Higher supply gives tenants choices, gives tenants more room for negotiation. But if people are going to sell their properties, then they're less inclined to, I don't know, rent. And if they sell, then they're done. And they can always move their money out of state or frankly, just out of LA, right? Ventura County is a great place to invest, or parts of Orange County, parts of Riverside. They don't necessarily have to move their money out of California. Many are choosing to. They're going to Tennessee, Florida, Texas, but it's really LA. So the reason why I wanted to do this episode was to explain that let's forget the sob story that's coming. It's really the tenants that are going to be hurting. And then on top of that, we see a lot of Blackstone. We hear a lot about institutional investors, and we don't want them to buy. But the reality is they're the only ones that can actually hold up LA, right? So if a tenant stops paying, a mom and pop investor doesn't have the money to pay for the attorneys. Institutional investors have attorneys on staff. So if you're afraid of institutional investors, the reality is we're setting ourselves up for it. Now, all these theories, right? People are going to tell me I'm full of it. They're going to tell me that's not accurate. Let's talk about proof. So right off the bat, we know that more supply does equal lower rents. We see it often in Texas and Florida in certain parts. They hold up about 30% of new construction in the entire country, by the way. But what we're seeing is they are able to keep up with demand, which then softens rents because people have options. For example, I remember me and a business partner, we considered writing an offer on a fourplex just outside of Austin, Texas. We were getting ready to hit sign for the offer until we did one last look at the comps. We saw up the street was a brand new apartment complex with all the amenities, gyms, pools, everything. And we realized we couldn't compete with that. Therefore, the only way we can compete is on lower rents. And at that point, the numbers didn't make sense. We didn't proceed with the property. Take Argentina as a country. They had rent control. They got rid of rent control. Inventory went up and rents actually went down. Now, in terms of price fixing, because that's what this is, right? We're capping how much they can raise. Let's take a look at the insurance companies. I did see on Instagram, people are like, the landlords have a problem with insurance. Go negotiate it with the insurance company. Guess what happened? State Farm left California. Safeco doesn't really issue any new policies. We're starting to see a lot of these insurance companies that are like, look, if you're going to cap how much I'm going to make, and the reality is it doesn't offset the claims that come in, I got to leave California. And that's exactly what they're doing. So it's just another example of trying to force people to fix pricing, and they don't have to play ball. That's really what this comes down to, is a lot of people argue that housing is a human right. Is it? That's debatable. There's no law that says that. I would make an argument, though, that housing is a necessity. I'm not saying it's not. But the reality is it's the private sector that provides the housing, right? So by doing that, you're biting the hand that feeds. So if you want housing, if you want affordable housing, then make it enticing to do it. There was a recent interview with Kevin O'Leary regarding New York, and he flat out said, I want to build affordable housing in New York. But if they do these rent freezes, if they do all these things, how is Kevin going to raise money to build it? No one's going to want to invest. So here's people who actually have the money, have the resources to build affordable housing. They're actually choosing not to. And if you start saying corporate greed, things like that, maybe they are greedy. But the reality is they have every right to be, because they are in the business of making money. You don't go to your job for free, you get paid for it. And if your costs go up, sometimes you go to your boss and say, hey, look, boss, my costs have gone up. I need a raise. But then your boss's response is, I would love to give you a raise, but by law, I can only raise it 1% or 4%. Now you're in a challenging situation. So we're starting to see a lot of use cases. If you ever have the time, there's a couple things I'd recommend. Whether you're a tenant, investor, buyer, seller, doesn't matter. Google Freakonomics Radio, rent control. Freakonomics, they had some fantastic books. They did an entire podcast episode all about rent control. And they looked at it through the lens of an economist, because this is an economic issue, right? Because we're providing a good and service, there's money involved. Listen, consider what they have to say. They talk about how there's an overconsumption of space, how there's an underconsumption of space. Meaning, let's say me and my wife, we rent a 3-bedroom apartment and we raise our kid there. Now, 30 years later, the kid's grown, gone off to college, moves out. We don't need 3 bedrooms, but because of rent control, we have no incentive to move. But here's all these new families coming in that need that 3-bedroom, but I'm not moving because I'm paying such cheap rent. And that keeps rents high because it keeps supply down. I could easily move into a 2-bedroom or a 1-bedroom because I don't need that much space. But why would I do the jump? So I encourage you to look into that. I would also encourage you to consider buying an investment property. It doesn't have to be in California. Even go out of state. Go to Alabama, Texas. I don't care. I think it'd be interesting to understand it from the other perspective, to understand what happens when you have to evict a tenant and now you have no income for 3 to 6 months, because it's not just evicting the tenant that costs money. They're not paying rent. They move out eventually. Then you got to focus on getting the unit ready, right? New carpeting, new floors, whatever. And then you got to get it on the market. So that could take you another couple months. So you're really 3 to 9 months before you actually have that tenant turnover, all because someone didn't pay. And in case you're wondering, No, I have done evictions before, and I don't just go straight to the eviction process. We always try to communicate with all of our tenants and say, okay, what's going on? And is there something we can do? Payment plan, or is it, hey, just catch up to what you owe and you can end the lease early? The last eviction I did, my property managers actually tried to communicate with them. Never heard from the tenants. They never tried to do a reach out. So I said, I guess we're going to have to do an eviction. We gave them an opportunity to have a conversation. So we are seeing that, and I encourage you to give it a shot. And if that doesn't sound like something you want to do, you want to stay a tenant, that's fine. But then don't be surprised when we see some of these repercussions going through. It will also be interesting to see what happens when apartment buildings are saying, you know what, we're going to switch to condos, meaning they're going to do a condo conversion and then sell them off individually and move on. The last thing I'll touch on is Measure ULA. That's the mansion tax. What people don't so basically what happens is any sales over, I think it's up to 5.1 or 5.3 million. We'll just say over 5 million. There's an additional transfer tax and an additional transfer tax over 10 million. The idea was the ultra wealthy, they can quote unquote afford it. What we ended up seeing was that less people actually sold. So all the realtors, home inspectors, assistants to loan officers, all these people, all the people in the quote unquote middle class that actually were part of these transactions just lost business. But let's talk about the big commercial side, because even though the mansion tax, quote unquote, was positioned towards single family, it actually also affected commercial. So what a lot of developers do when you see what's on construction of these big apartment buildings is they'll build them, rent them out, hold on to them for, let's say, 3 to 5 years, and then sell. There's always an exit because they need to pay back their investors. Because of the mansion tax, Measure ULA, there's no profit to be made because we're talking millions of dollars in taxes. UCLA recently came out with a study that said we're actually seeing a decline in building of apartments, which out of all the types of classifications for housing, those would be the most affordable, right? Forget location, just an apartment would logically rent for less than a single family. So because of that, we're losing at about 1,900 units per year. And the money that came in for Measure ULA, they're not keeping up with that difference. They're not closing the gap. So we're seeing a decrease in affordable housing pretty rapidly. Between that, mom and pop selling, it's going to get rough unless city council does something. And what can they do? They can eliminate rent control. That is actually probably the most ideal. There's enough studies that support it. That's unlikely to happen. So it's probably going to need to happen is a couple things. And this is just my opinion. One, they probably need to raise the caps on rents, right? Maybe it's 5 to 10%. And just say, look, rents are going to go up. It just is what it is. Second thing they can do is actually speed up the eviction process for those tenants that are rightfully in the wrong, right? If they stop paying rent, then they need to be evicted. If you speed up that process, it allows more active units on the market, which then gives tenants choices, so on and so forth. So there are a couple things. Happy to sit down with anyone and talk about the issue. I think it's super interesting. And I think it's a real problem. I think we do have an affordability issue, but I also think that there are some solutions with some compromises. So I'll leave you with this. We live in Southern California. Where in the world could you go surfing in the morning and snowboarding that same afternoon? Where in the world can you get Peruvian food, El Salvadorian food, Ethiopian food, Eastern European food? Where in the world can you go to Universal Studios in the morning, drive down to Disneyland, go to Disneyland, still come back to downtown LA in time to party it up in the evening? Los Angeles, Southern California has a lot to offer, including great weather, and there is going to be a premium for that. We do have to somewhat check our egos at the door and realize that the city has a lot to offer, hiking, tennis courts, whatever you want to call it, and there's a premium for it. So if it's something that you're like, no, I don't want to pay for that premium, then maybe you should consider moving. It's an unfortunate reality, but it is our reality. Love to get your thoughts. Feel free to reach out. No hate mail. Let's just have a legitimate conversation and maybe try to come up with a great solution. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next week. Want to keep unlocking the secrets to building real wealth in Los Angeles? Stick around for the next episode. Tap the video on screen. Keep watching.